What would you do if you had just become the new owner of an airline, only to be publicly shamed on your very first flight? For CEO Rashawn Peterson, this wasn't a what-if. As he took his seat in first class, Harvard medal still in his bag, a flight attendant looked him dead in the eye and said the 6 words that would ignite a firestorm. "Sir, you in the wrong seat." The way she looked at him said it all. You don't belong here. But what she didn't know was that the man she just tried to humiliate owned the plane. And what happened next, no one on that flight will ever forget. It all happened on Apex A Flight 227, a Thursday morning shuttle from Atlanta to New York that was about to become a battleground. Inside the glowing, sterile luxury of the cabin, passengers sipped champagne while Rashawn Peterson settled into seat 1B. He wore a navy blue suit so sharp it could cut glass, his salt and pepper hair trimmed in a perfect sponge twist fade. His presence was calm but commanding, a man accustomed to billion-dollar deals, not baseless accusations. He just left the Harvard Business Leaders Summit, a viral sensation shaking hands with senators and mayors. But on this plane, in this seat, none of that seemed to matter. As Rashawn took a sip of his espresso, the white flight attendant, Cheryl, approached him, her smile practiced and thin. "Sir," she repeated, her voice a soft, condescending purr. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. You in the wrong seat." The cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward them. Behind her, an older white passenger with a gold Rolex and an impatient smirk stood waiting. "That's my seat," the man announced, his voice loud enough for the entire section to hear, dripping with unearned authority. Rashawn looked up slowly, his composure fraying into a cold thread of disbelief. "I booked this seat weeks ago," he said, his voice even, controlled. He held up his boarding pass, his name clearly printed beside 1B. But Cheryl didn't even glance at it. She leaned closer, her whisper a mix of false politeness and a veiled threat. "Please, sir, don't make a scene." A scene, as if he were the one creating the disturbance. Humiliation burned through him like fire. He could feel the stays, see the phones already rising like tiny digital vultures, ready to capture his shame. This wasn't a mistake. This was a public stripping, a man of immense power being treated like an imposter. He had to stand, not because he was wrong, but because the world was watching, and he knew this battle wouldn't be won by shouting. He rose to his feet, straightened his jacket, and adjusted his cufflinks with a slow, deliberate motion. His face was a mask of unreadable calm. But as he met Cheryl's triumphant gaze, one question cut through the noise in his head. This wasn't random. This felt organized. Why was she so determined to see him removed? Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. With the eyes of the entire first-class cabin on him, Rashawn didn't retreat. He held his ground, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the simmering hostility in the air. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor, please," or the lead flight attendant. He wasn't asking, he was informing. It was the first step in any corporate dispute. Escalate calmly, follow the chain of command. He was giving them a chance to correct their own mistake. Cheryl's smirk tightened. She disappeared for a moment behind the curtain, returning with a woman who wore her authority like a shield. This was the lead attendant. She didn't offer a name, only a cold, evaluative stare. Cheryl whispered something in her ear, and just like that, the verdict was delivered before the trial even began. "Sir," the supervisor said, her voice dripping with corporate jargon, "due to an operational necessity, we had to reassign this seat. Our records are final. Have you ever held the truth in your hands, plain as day, only to be told it doesn't exist?" Rashawn held up his boarding pass again. The crisp paper felt like the only sane thing in a world gone mad. "My name is Rashawn Peterson. This pass says seat 1B. It was confirmed this morning." The supervisor didn't even look at it. She waved a dismissive hand. "Our system doesn't show that," she said, the words echoing the ultimate corporate excuse. The system was a faceless god, and its word was absolute. At that moment, Rashawn knew. This wasn't a mix-up. This was bias wrapped in bureaucracy, Racism laundered through a fake digital era. The system wasn't failing. It was working exactly as it was designed to. He glanced around. He saw passengers staring, a mix of pity, discomfort, and for a few, cruel entertainment. They were witnesses to a quiet execution of his dignity. He lowered his voice, making sure only the two women could hear the ice in his tone. "You're about to make a mistake you can't undo." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed the supervisor's face, but it was replaced instantly with arrogance. She gave a small, condescending smirk. "I think we'll be fine," she said. As if on cue, the cockpit door opened. The pilot, a man with cold, impatient eyes, leaned out. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't look at Rashawn's ticket. He simply looked at Rashawn. "Sir, please comply so we can take off," he commanded. The final wall of authority had slammed down. From the flight attendant to the supervisor to the captain, the entire system had closed ranks to protect its own. There was no appeal. Defeated but not broken, Rashawn gave a single, sharp nod. He turned and walked away from the seat he had paid for, from the status he had earned, and took a lesser seat in the back of the section. The injustice was complete, the humiliation now a public spectacle. The plane began to move, but the tension was far from over. Because while all eyes were on Rashawn, a young flight attendant named Marisol, hidden near the galley, was staring at her phone. Her hands were shaking, but her finger had just pressed record. In the controlled chaos of the airplane cabin, most people see only what they're supposed to see: the passengers, the crew, the performance of service. But justice often finds its greatest ally in the person nobody is watching. Her name was Marisol, a young Latina flight attendant. Only a few months on the job, she stood near the galley, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the rules: stay quiet, be invisible, don't get involved. But her conscience was screaming louder than any corporate policy. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mix-up. She had seen the way Cheryl and the lead attendant exchanged a knowing glance. It felt like a trap, and Rashawn Peterson had just walked into it. Her training told her to look away, but her gut told her to bear witness. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone, hiding it behind a stack of napkins. She angled it just right, pressing record as the supervisor waved away Rashawn's boarding pass. Her lens captured the cold, dismissive smirk on the other passenger's face as he slid into seat 1B, the seat that wasn't his. But most importantly, her camera caught the moment that would later break the internet: the image of Rashawn Peterson. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't pleading. He was just standing there in his sharp suit, his dignity a silent, unbreakable shield against the storm of humiliation. It was the kind of image that speaks more than words ever could. It was the picture of grace under fire. After Rashawn completed the silent, humiliating walk to a lesser seat near the galley, the seatbelt sign pinged on, and Marisol slipped away, her breath catching in her throat. She quickly typed a message to her friend, her thumbs flying across the screen. "This isn't right." They set him up. She hit send, creating the first piece of undeniable evidence. She had the proof on her phone, a few seconds of video that would prove to be more powerful than any airline's official statement. But as the plane climbed to 30,000 feet, she had no idea that Rashawn was about to escalate his fight. He wasn't waiting for the plane to land. He reached up and pressed the flight attendant call button above his new, inferior seat. The light chimed, a small, defiant sound cutting through the engine's roar. The soft chime of the call button hung in the air for a moment before Cheryl appeared, her expression a mask of forced patience. "Yes?" she asked, her tone making it clear she was not there to help. Rashawn didn't look angry. He looked like a CEO in a boardroom, calm and direct, refusing to be rattled. "I'm politely requesting again that I be moved to seat 1B, which is the seat I paid for," he stated, his voice even. "I'm sure if you check the records properly, you'll see the error." He was offering them one last, professional off-ramp, a chance to save face. Cheryl, however, decided to set it on fire. She leaned down, her voice a low hiss. "Listen to me," she whispered, all pretense of customer service gone. "Keep pushing this, and I will have Port Authority security waiting for you when we land. Do you understand me?" It was a direct threat, a promise of escalation from a simple seating dispute to a federal incident. The message was clear. A black man asking for what is owed is not a customer, he's a threat. I understand perfectly, Rashawn replied, his voice dangerously quiet. Get your superior on the phone. Now. Cheryl's eyes flashed with fury, but she complied, disappearing to the galley to make the call. She returned moments later, holding a phone out to Rashawn. On the other end was Todd Hensley, a senior officer from Apex Air's in-flight management. He was the corporate enforcer, the voice that came on the line when an issue needed to be crushed, not solved. Mr. Hensley, Rashawn began, I am a first-class passenger on this flight, and Hensley cut him off. His voice was slick with bureaucratic venom. I've been briefed by my staff, sir. It seems you're having trouble following instructions. It's a full flight, and we need to maintain order. The only disorder, Rashawn said, was me being removed from a seat I legally purchased. Then came the words that changed everything. The phrase that stripped away all plausible deniability and laid the ugly truth bare for the entire cabin to hear. Hensley's voice crackled through the phone, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear clearly. You people always think the rules don't apply to you. You people. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the cabin. Jaws tightened. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide. The insult wasn't just directed at Rashawn anymore. It was an indictment of every person of color who had ever been told they were less than. Have you ever been hit with a phrase like that? A verbal shorthand designed to shrink your entire existence into a single, ugly stereotype. Rashawn didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, Thank you, Mr. Hensley. You've made the situation perfectly clear. He handed the phone back to a smirking Cheryl. Then, he did something no one expected. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small, black leather notebook and a fountain pen, and began to write. He jotted down the time, the flight number, and two names, Cheryl and Todd Hensley. Then, he underlined Hensley's name twice. The ink was black, final. In the silent, brutal calculus of corporate power, that simple gesture wasn't just a note. It was an execution order waiting to be signed. As he closed the book, his eyes began to scan the cabin, not with anger, but with the cold, detached precision of a new owner taking inventory of the assets he would keep and the liabilities he was about to liquidate for the next hour of the flight. Rashawn Peterson became a ghost. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for a thing. He simply watched. From his lesser seat, he conducted a silent, brutal audit of the company he was about to own. He watched Cheryl dote on the man in seat 1B, offering him a second drink with a warm, deferential smile. He noted how she and the other flight attendants avoided his aisle, the movements stiff and deliberate. He observed the order of service, the tone of voice used for each passenger, the subtle hierarchies of race and class playing out at 30,000 feet. Every smile, every clipped response, every averted gaze was a data point. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a predator, studying the ecosystem he was about to disrupt forever. As the plane began its initial descent toward New York, Cheryl passed his row to collect trash. Rashawn stopped her, not with anger, but with a simple, almost academic question. His voice was calm, curious. I just have one last question for you, he said. Do you know who owns the airline you work for? The question was so unexpected it caught her completely off guard. She looked at him, a confused, arrogant smirk spreading across her face. Then, she laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a full, condescending laugh, loud enough for the rows around them to hear. I have no idea, she scoffed, but I'm pretty sure it's not you. A faint smile touched Rashawn's lips. It didn't reach his eyes. That's what I thought, he said, and dismissed her with a nod. That was all he needed. The final confirmation. As she walked away, basking in her perceived victory, Rashawn pulled out his encrypted business phone. He typed a single, cryptic message to his executive assistant, a code word she would understand instantly. The message was just one word: execute. He hit send. Something shifted in his eyes then. The last embers of personal humiliation died out, replaced by the cold, clear light of strategic action. This was no longer about revenge for a slight. It was about legacy. It was about the moment a system of bias, arrogance, and disrespect was about to collide with a power it never saw coming. On the plane, nothing had changed. But on the ground, that one-word message set in motion a sequence of events that would liquidate careers and shatter the chain of command at Apex Air before the plane's wheels even touched the tarmac. The seed of power had not just been planted. It was about to bloom with devastating force. While Rashawn Peterson's coded message was quietly triggering a corporate takeover on Wall Street, a different kind of explosion was happening on the internet. Marisol, the young flight attendant, sat anxiously in her jump seat, the video file burning a hole in her phone. She knew the risk. A single anonymous post could be traced, and it would cost her the job she desperately needed to support her family. But the image of Rashawn's quiet dignity, contrasted with the ugly, smug satisfaction on the faces of her coworkers, was a memory she couldn't erase. Doing nothing felt like being an accomplice. Stealing her nerves, she sent the 30-second clip to her cousin, a social media activist, with a simple, 3-word message: make them famous. He did. The video hit X, formerly Twitter, at the exact moment Flight 227 was making its final approach into JFK. At first, it was just a ripple, a few hundred views, then 1,000. Then it jumped to Instagram Reels and TikTok, and the ripple became a tidal wave. The shaky footage was brutal in its honesty. You didn't just see the confrontation, you felt it. You heard the condescending, saccharine poison in Cheryl's voice as she whispered, "Don't make a scene." You saw the cold, dismissive authority in the supervisor's eyes. And you saw the quiet, soul-crushing walk Rashawn had to take away from his seat as the man with the Rolex slid into it. The internet erupted in a firestorm of collective outrage. #Seat1B began trending in New York, then Chicago, then Los Angeles, until it was the #1 trend in the United States. Users on TikTok were using the audio to create skits mocking the airline. Instagram was flooded with comments. People immediately recognized Rashawn. "Wait, isn't that the CEO who just gave that incredible speech at Harvard?" one user wrote. Suddenly, clips of his viral speech on corporate equality were being stitched side by side with a video of his humiliation. The hypocrisy was staggering, and it poured gasoline on the fire. Major news outlets smelled blood in the water. CNN, MSNBC, and even the Shade Room had the story on their homepages before the plane's wheels touched the ground. The story was simple, powerful, and infuriating. Harvard keynote speaker humiliated on Apex Air flight. Apex Air, caught completely flat-footed, rushed to release a statement. It was a masterpiece of corporate cowardice, a word salad of non-apologies. Apex Air is aware of an incident involving a passenger seating miscommunication. It read, "We are looking into the matter to ensure our operational protocols were followed. We value the experience of all our guests and are committed to a thorough internal review." Miscommunication. Internal review. The empty words were so insulting, so dismissive, that they only made things worse. The comments sections flooded with rage. A miscommunication? Funny how the mix-up only ever happens to people who look like him. Another wrote, "Fire them all. I'm canceling my Apex credit card today. #boycott Apex Air." The internet was judge, jury, and executioner, and it had reached a unanimous verdict. Millions of people were now furious, and they were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But while the entire world was screaming Rashawn Peterson's name online, inside the sterile, soundproof crisis room at Apex Air headquarters, a panicked PR executive was screaming a far more urgent question at his team. A question that was about to unravel everything they thought they knew. Who the hell is Rashawn Peterson? Inside the glass-walled crisis room at Apex Air headquarters, chaos had a soundtrack, 6 phones ringing at once, the frantic clatter of keyboards, and the sharp, panicked voice of the PR director. "I don't care about the hashtag," he screamed. "I need a name. Who the hell is Rashawn Peterson?" A terrified junior analyst, sweating in his wrinkled shirt, finally found the answer. His voice trembled as he read from his screen. "Sir, I found him. His Rashawn Peterson, the CEO and founder of Peterson Global Holdings. A stunned silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. Peterson Global Holdings wasn't just some company. It was a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm known for hostile takeovers. The PR director's face went pale. He had assumed this was a problem with a disgruntled passenger. He now realized they had a problem with a titan of industry. "Get legal on the phone," he stammered. "Get the board chairman on the phone. We need to." "Sir," the analyst interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. There's more." He swallowed hard. According to a press release that just went live 60 seconds ago, Peterson Global Holdings finalized a deal at 8 a.m. this morning. He paused, unable to finish the sentence. "A deal for what?" the director shouted. The analyst looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "A deal to acquire a 51% controlling interest in Apex Air." The air was sucked out of the room. Panic turned to pure, ice-cold horror. The incessant ringing of the phones suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. They hadn't just humiliated a black man. They had publicly humiliated their new owner. Legal teams began scrambling, shouting into phones about liability and severance clauses. One executive, clutching his chest, yelled a desperate, futile order into his phone, directed at their team at JFK. "Find him. Do not let him speak to the press. Whatever you do, stop him." But it was already too late, because as he screamed that order, the live news feed on the giant screen in the crisis room switched to a shot of the jetway at JFK Gate B-23. And through the window, with cameras flashing all around it, Flight 227 was calmly rolling to a stop. The reckoning had arrived. The jet bridge connected to the plane with a heavy thud. For the passengers, it was the end of a flight. For Cheryl and her crew, it was supposed to be the end of their problem. She stood near the front, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, fully expecting to see two uniformed Port Authority officers board the plane to escort Rashawn off. Have you ever dreamed of the moment when someone who wronged you finally realizes exactly who they were messing with? For Rashawn Peterson, that moment had just arrived. The plane door opened, and two men in uniforms did step on board. But they weren't security. They were Apex Air's own ground security. And right behind them were two other men in rumpled, expensive suits, their faces pale and slick with sweat. They were senior executives, and they looked like they had just run a marathon. Cheryl's victorious smirk was still plastered on her face, ready to point out the disruptive passenger. But the executives stormed right past her without a glance, their eyes locking onto Rashawn with a desperate terror she had only ever seen on passengers during severe turbulence. Her smirk didn't just falter, it evaporated, replaced by a shadow of confusion. Why were they ignoring her? Why were they looking at him like that? One of the executives, a man named Henderson, practically stumbled forward. "Mr. Peterson," he began, his voice a desperate, stammering mess. The name hit the air, and Cheryl felt a jolt, as if from a cattle prod. Mr. Peterson. They knew his name. The lead attendant, who had been standing proudly beside Cheryl, visibly flinched. The captain's professional mask cracked, a line of sweat suddenly beading on his forehead. They were no longer in control. The ground had just vanished from beneath their feet. On behalf of Apex Air, Henderson continued, his hands trembling slightly. "We are so sorry. We had no idea. We didn't know." And in that moment, seeing the unadulterated fear in her boss's eyes, Cheryl finally understood. The trap she thought she had sprung had just slammed shut on her. Rashawn cut the executive off, his voice slicing through the panicked apology. He wasn't loud, but every single person on that plane heard him. "That's the problem," Rashawn said, his eyes like chips of ice. "You never know. You never see. You look, but you don't see who you're looking down on." He let the words hang in the air, a final verdict on the company's culture of willful blindness. He then turned his gaze to Cheryl, the lead attendant, and the captain who had sheepishly emerged from the cockpit. "I have reserved the terminal conference room," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. You, and the captain. Meet me there in 5 minutes." He then looked back at the terrified executives. "You two as well." Without another word, he walked off the plane, the sea of passengers parting for him like he was royalty. The conference room was cold and sterile. One by one, the flight crew filed in, their arrogance replaced by annoying, stomach-churning fear. The executives stood awkwardly in the corner. Rashawn sat at the head of the table, his posture perfect, his calm absolute. He let the silence stretch for a full minute. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, sharp, and stripped of all emotion. "You didn't just embarrass a man today," he began. "You embarrassed a brand. You embarrassed your shareholders. You embarrassed your co-workers who actually do their jobs without prejudice. Your actions today were not a miscommunication. They were a liability." The executives were silent, paralyzed. The crew stayed at the floor. Rashawn picked up his phone. He pressed a single name on his contact list, the chairman of the board. The call connected instantly. "It's Rashawn," he said into the phone. "I'm at JFK. I've identified the employees involved in the incident on Flight 227. He paused. "Their names are Cheryl Miller, Captain Robert Webb, and the ground manager who authorized their conduct, Todd Hensley. Terminate their employment. Effective immediately." He hung up, just like that. 3 careers, vaporized by a single, 10-second phone call. Cheryl looked up, her face a mask of disbelief, her mouth hanging open. The captain looked like he was going to collapse. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably rewritten. But this was only the first tremor of the earthquake. Because as the news of the instant firings hit the internal Apex network, something else began to happen on the stock exchange ticker in the corner of the room. The company's stock, which had been stable all morning, took its first, terrifying nosedive. The terminations were a match thrown on a puddle of gasoline. But before that news exploded publicly, another, quieter event had taken place. While the world was watching the video, Rashawn's security team had already identified the source of the leak, Marisol. From the back of a black SUV speeding away from the airport, Rashawn made a brief, encrypted call to her personal cell. She answered, her voice trembling. He didn't offer her a promotion or bonus. He recognized her courage, told her he was going to fix the company, and asked if she would be willing to help. He was giving her a choice. Her quiet yes was all he needed to hear. Now, the public fallout was hitting. An Apex employee inside the JFK terminal sent a text to a reporter, and within minutes, the story was a breaking news banner on every major network. New Apex Air owner fires flight crew moments after landing. At the airport, reporters swarmed the terminal, their cameras a blinding sea of flashing lights. On Wall Street, the stock ticker for Apex Air turned into a blood-red waterfall. Investors were panicking. The company wasn't just having a PR crisis. It was in a full-blown financial freefall, losing hundreds of millions in value by the minute. In a high-rise office in Manhattan, the remaining members of the Apex Air board of directors were in a state of pure terror. They demanded an emergency meeting with their new majority owner. The message they sent was urgent, bordering on desperate. They needed to stop the bleeding before he destroyed the entire company. Rashawn's response was a masterclass in power. He agreed to the meeting time, but an email from his office informed the board that Mr. Peterson would not be attending personally. He was sending a representative in his place. The board members were confused, insulted even. Who could he possibly send? When the door to the boardroom opened, they all stared in stunned disbelief. In walked Marisol, still in her uniform. She was nervous, but her eyes were filled with a quiet, steely resolve. Rashawn hadn't sent a suit. He had sent the truth. She walked to the head of the table, placed her phone down, and played the video. For the next 10 minutes, she gave her testimony. Her voice, clear and steady, became the cornerstone of a corporate reckoning. Rashawn had turned the chaos into a movement, taking the lowest-ranking person in the room and giving her more power than all the men in expensive suits combined. Marisol held the entire company's future in her hands, and the board knew it. They had demanded a meeting with their king, but he had sent a single-foot soldier instead. And her presence delivered a chilling message. The old guard was finished. Now, all they could do was wait for Rashawn Peterson himself to arrive and deliver the terms of their surrender. The next day, Rashawn Peterson finally met Arthur Vance, the longtime chairman of Apex Air, in a penthouse boardroom overlooking Central Park. The air in the room was thick with tension. Vance, a man in his late 60s with a face accustomed to country clubs and unquestioned authority, was visibly unnerved. He had spent the last 24 hours watching his company's stock price get butchered and its name become a global synonym for corporate racism. He was prepared to offer a groveling apology, a massive private settlement, anything to make the problem, and the man sitting opposite him, go away. Vance cleared his throat, launching into a pre-rehearsed speech about this unfortunate incident and rebuilding shareholder confidence. He started to float the idea of a generous donation to a charity of Mr. Peterson's choice as a sign of goodwill. Rashawn held up a hand, and the chairman's voice died in his throat. "Arthur," Rashawn said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "let's be clear. I am not here for an apology, and I am certainly not here for your money." Vance looked confused. "Then, what do you want?" "I don't want anything," Rashawn corrected him. "I'm here to tell you what is going to happen." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with the chairman's. "First, you will overhaul your diversity and inclusion policies, from the cockpit to the boardroom. The new policies will be drafted by a third-party firm that I select. Second, you will implement mandatory, longitudinal bias training for every single employee. Not a one-hour webinar, but a real, measurable program that tracks performance and weeds out those who can't or won't adapt. And third, you will create a public accountability report to be published quarterly, detailing complaints, resolutions, and demographic data on hiring and promotions." The chairman hesitated, his face turning a blotchy red. He saw months of logistical nightmares, union pushback, and above all, terrible PR. "Rashawn, with all due respect, a public report like that, the press would crucify us. The perception." "This isn't PR, Arthur," Rashawn cut in, his voice dangerously low. "This is history correcting itself. You can either be on the right side of it, or you can be its next casualty." With that, an assistant entered the room and placed a final stack of documents on the table. They were the last pages of the acquisition deal. While Vance watched in stunned silence, Rashawn Peterson uncapped his pen and signed the final page. The smooth, deliberate stroke of his signature was the only sound in the room. Peterson Global Holdings now officially and irrevocably controlled Apex Air. He capped his pen and stood up, looking down at the defeated chairman. "As my first act as the new majority owner," he announced, "I am launching an internal initiative to oversee these changes. We're calling it Operation Seat 1B. The name hung in the air, a permanent brand on the company's soul. Rashawn turned to leave the room, his work here done. Vance, still reeling, had no idea that the first public phase of that operation was already in motion. His phone buzzed, and he looked down to see a news alert from CNN. "Breaking news. Apex Air schedules live press conference. Fired flight attendant Cheryl Miller to issue public statement." The news that Cheryl Miller, the captain, and a senior manager had been fired didn't just make waves. It created a hurricane in the 24-hour news cycle. As predicted, the public debate was instantaneous and deeply divided. On one side, you had a chorus of voices screaming that the punishment was far too severe. Pundits on conservative news channels called it a gross overreaction, another example of cancel culture run amok. "So now we fire people for a simple seating mistake," one host asked indignantly. Online, anonymous accounts flooded comment sections, arguing that Cheryl was just doing her job and that a good employee had lost her livelihood because of a temperamental, entitled CEO. They called it harsh, unfair, and a dangerous precedent. But for every one of those voices, 10 others rose up in a roar of approval. They called it overdue. They called it accountability. For millions of people, this wasn't about one seat on one plane. It was about every time they had been followed in a store, every time they had been passed over for a promotion, every time they had been made to feel like they didn't belong in a space they had every right to be in. They saw Cheryl not just as one flight attendant, but as a symbol of the everyday, casual racism that so often goes unpunished. What do you think? Was it a necessary act of justice, or a punishment that went too far? While the world debated, Rashawn Peterson was working. He wasn't interested in the online arguments or the talking heads on TV. He personally commissioned an independent auditing firm to begin a top-to-bottom review of Apex Air's hiring, complaint, and promotion data. He made it clear that the initial firings were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. He was ensuring that the investigation would reveal the systemic patterns of bias that allowed an incident like this to happen in the first place. Then came the moment that solidified the new era at Apex Air. 2 days after the incident, the company held a live, formal press conference. The stage wasn't filled with the old guard of stone-faced white men. Instead, the newly appointed interim VP of Operations, a black woman with decades of experience, stood at the podium. Her apology was not the weak, jargon-filled statement from before. It was direct, sincere, and unflinching. She acknowledged the blatant act of racism that occurred and announced the details of the new accountability measures. Near the end of her speech, she shared a message directly from the new owner. She looked straight into the camera and said, "Mr. Peterson has made it clear to every one of us that his goal here is not about revenge. His philosophy is simple. Accountability isn't revenge. It's repair. Today, we begin the long and difficult work of repairing the trust we have broken." That single quote, "Accountability is repair," became the headline. It was a masterstroke. It reframed the entire narrative from one of anger to one of constructive action. Social media erupted with a tidal wave of support. Rashawn Peterson was no longer just a business story. He was a phenomenon. He became a household name, a symbol not of wealth, but of a new, more dignified kind of power. The world had seen justice served. But what no one could predict was how the story of Seat 1B would soon escape the news cycle and begin to appear in a very different place. The lesson plans of business schools and the HR training manuals of Fortune 500 companies across the globe. True change isn't just measured in stock prices or firings. It's measured by how a story seeps into the soul of a culture. The event of Apex A Flight 227 did more than just dominate the news for a week. They became a landmark, a permanent case study in the modern corporate world. Business schools from Harvard to Stanford began teaching the Seat 1B case as a masterclass in crisis management, corporate ethics, and the financial cost of unchecked bias. HR departments in Fortune 500 companies revamped their training manuals, using the incident as a stark, undeniable example of what not to do. News outlets, in the year-end wrap-ups, gave the story a title that stuck, a headline that perfectly captured its impact: "The Day Corporate Racism Got Grounded." But Rashawn Peterson was never one to be satisfied with just becoming a symbol. He immediately leveraged the global attention to create something lasting. He used his personal capital to launch the Seat 1B Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to creating pathways for equitable hiring and promotion within the entire aviation industry, from the tarmac to the C-suite. His goal was to ensure that no person of color would ever again be made to feel like an imposter in a space they helped build. And in his first, most celebrated move as the foundation's chairman, he announced its official spokesperson. It wasn't a celebrity or a politician. It was Marisol. The world watched as the young woman who had risked her job to record a 30-second video now stood confidently at press conferences, speaking with eloquence and passion about the need for integrity. Her journey from a nervous witness to a powerful advocate was, in itself, a testament to the change that was now unfolding. The Seat 1B case had become a global lesson, with Rashawn and Marisol as its public faces. The world saw the victory and the reforms. But behind the scenes, far away from the cameras and the accolades, the story wasn't quite over. Because one of the people whose life had been shattered by the incident, the former flight attendant Cheryl Miller, had just picked up a pen, and she was about to write a letter that no one, least of all Rashawn Peterson, ever expected to receive. Months passed. The storm of the Seat 1B incident had subsided into the calm waters of history. Apex Air, under the steady hand of Operation Seat 1B, was thriving, its stock price recovered and its reputation slowly mending. The world, for the most part, had moved on. Then, an envelope arrived at Rashawn Peterson's private office. It wasn't from a corporation or law firm. It was a simple, personal letter, handwritten on plain stationery. The return address was a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The sender was Cheryl Miller. Rashawn opened it, unsure of what to expect. A lawsuit threat? A plea for money? It was neither. The letter inside was raw, broken, and deeply, painfully remorseful. In messy, tear-stained ink, Cheryl wrote about losing her job, her house, and the respect of her community. But then, she wrote something that stopped Rashawn cold. She didn't blame him. She wrote that in the quiet of a new, smaller life, she had been forced to confront the truth of her actions on that day. She admitted, for the first time to anyone, that it wasn't a misunderstanding or protocol issue. She had acted out of fear and an ugly, ingrained bias she never had the courage to face until it cost her everything. Rashawn read the letter once, then twice, in the silence of his office. There was no triumph, no feeling of victory. He just felt the profound weight of a human being's painful self-awareness. After a long moment, a soft, unexpected smile touched his lips. It was a smile of recognition, not of an enemy, but of a fellow traveler who had lost her way. He took out his own personal stationery, the thick cream-colored paper bearing his simple monogram. He could have ignored her. He could have had a lawyer send a cease and desist. Instead, he uncapped his fountain pen and wrote back a single, elegant line. "We're all passengers learning how to fly higher." He folded the note, sealed it, and had it sent. It was a quiet, private act between two people unseen by the world. Because real accountability isn't just about public punishment. Forgiveness, if it is to mean anything at all, must begin privately. But Rashawn Peterson saw this not as an end, but as a beginning. And he was about to make a decision, a public gesture so radical and unexpected that it would once again put him and Cheryl Miller at the center of a global conversation. Nearly a year to the day after the incident on Flight 227, the media gathered at JFK Airport for a very different kind of Apex Air event. The occasion was the grand opening of the brand-new Apex Air Diversity Lounge, a state-of-the-art space located in the terminal, a tangible symbol of the sweeping changes Rashawn Peterson had implemented. The mood was celebratory. Reporters mingled with airline executives, a noticeably more diverse group than a year ago, sipping champagne under soft lighting. Marisol, now the confident and well-respected head of the Seat 1B Foundation, was warmly greeting guests. This was a victory lap, a press event designed to showcase a corporation reborn. Rashawn Peterson took to the podium to a wave of applause. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a cultural figure, a man who had become synonymous with integrity and a new kind of power. He spoke about the progress the airline had made, the success of the new bias training programs, and the work the foundation was doing. The reporters dutifully took notes, expecting a standard, positive corporate speech. "The changes we've made are not just about policies and procedures," Rashawn said, his voice resonating through the lounge. "They are about people. Accountability is about repair, but true reform is about redemption." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "And in that spirit, I want to introduce you to someone who has been on a remarkable journey of her own. A journey of reflection, accountability, and a willingness to learn. Please welcome Ms. Cheryl Miller." A collective gasp went through the room. For a second, there was a stunned, deafening silence, followed by an explosion of camera flashes as 1,000 shutters clicked at once. Was this a joke? Was he about to publicly shame her? The reporters leaned forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and predatory excitement. Cheryl Miller walked onto the stage. She looked different. The hard, arrogant edge was gone, replaced by a profound humility. She was nervous, her hands clasped in front of her, but she met the glare of the cameras with a quiet resolve. Rashawn stood beside her, not as a conqueror beside his vanquished foe, but as a sponsor. He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Cheryl and I have been in communication for several months," he explained to the shocked audience. "Her journey has not been easy, but it has been honest, and I have come to see her not as a symbol of a problem, but as a symbol of the possibility of change." He then turned the microphone over to her. In a trembling but clear voice, Cheryl gave a short, powerful speech, not making excuses but taking full ownership of the fear and prejudice that had driven her actions. She announced she would be working with the Seat 1B Foundation, sharing her story with new trainees as a lesson in what can go wrong and how one can begin to make it right. Then came the line from Rashawn that would define the entire event. He took the microphone back and looked out at the world. "We have to believe that people are capable of change," he said, his voice filled with a profound sense of grace. Because real reform doesn't just erase mistakes, it redeems people. The moment went viral, just as the first one had. But this time, the hashtags weren't about anger and boycotts. They were #grace, #redemption, and #second chance. The world saw a new side of power. Not the power to crush, but the power to lift up. Not the force of a fist, but the strength of an open hand. The image of Rashawn Peterson, the black CEO, standing beside Cheryl Miller, the white flight attendant who had tried to erase him, was now on every screen. It was a moment of unbelievable grace that silenced both his critics and his most aggressive champions. The world had seen him take the company, they'd seen him clean house, and now they'd seen him offer a path forward to the very person who caused the storm. The only question left to answer was, a year from now, what would be the real, lasting legacy of Seat 1B? 2 years have passed. To understand the true legacy of Seat 1B, you had to go back to where it all started, JFK Airport. But the Terminal 4 that stands here now, on this crisp Saturday afternoon in October 2025, feels like a different world. The Apex Air Gate area is no longer a space of cold, sterile luxury, but one of warmth and vibrant life. The flight crew preparing for the 3 p.m. departure to Atlanta is a picture of the world as it should be. The lead pilot is a sharp, confident black woman, her co-pilot a young man of South Asian descent. A gate agent with a Sikh turban helps an elderly white couple with their boarding passes, both parties smiling. The passengers themselves are a relaxed, eclectic mix of humanity, families, business travelers, students, all mingling with an ease that was once unimaginable. The air buzzes not with tension, but with the pleasant hum of a company that is comfortable in its own skin. This is the change you can see. Through the crowd walks Rashawn Peterson. He wears a simple cashmere sweater and slacks. No sharp suit needed. He is no longer an outsider here. He is the architect. As he passes a check-in desk, a young black woman in an Apex uniform looks up. She doesn't say a word, but her eyes meet his, and she gives him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It's a gesture of profound, silent gratitude. A thank you, not for a job, but for the dignity that came with it. He returns the nod, his heart full. This is the change you can feel. He arrives at a small gathering by Gate B23. A crowd of journalists and airline employees are clustered around a newly unveiled brass plaque. Standing beside him are Marisol, now the formidable executive director of the Seat 1B Foundation, and Arthur Vance, the once arrogant chairman, now humbled and genuinely supportive. A young reporter, clutching a microphone, steps forward. "Mr. Peterson," she begins, her voice earnest. "My name is Kyla, and I just graduated from Columbia Journalism. We studied the Seat 1B case in my ethics class. We've all seen the video, we've read the stories. But there's one question no one has ever really answered. That day, on that plane, when they threatened you and humiliated you, most people would have fought back with rage. But you never did. How did you stay so calm?" Rashawn watches as a plane ascends into the clouds, a faint smile on his face. He turns to the young reporter, his eyes holding the quiet confidence of a man who has been tested by fire and emerged not burned, but forged. He gave the answer that would become the final, defining quote of the entire saga. "Because the louder they tried to shrink me," he said, his voice calm and clear, "the bigger I became." He didn't need to say anything else. Kyla lowered her microphone, the simple profundity of the answer leaving her speechless. That was the real secret, wasn't it? The core of his hidden strength. It was the ancient, powerful alchemy of resilience, the ability to take the poison of hatred and transform it into the fuel of internal growth. His power wasn't in his wallet or his title. It was in his unshakable sense of self-worth. In a world that constantly tries to tell you that you are less than, true power is the refusal to believe it. They took his seat, threatened his freedom, and challenged his dignity, all because they looked at a black man and saw an imposter. They saw what they wanted to see, a two-dimensional stereotype shaped by their own prejudice. They never bothered to look deeper. What they failed to see was the man in full, the leader, the owner. In the end, they learned that power comes in many forms. There is the fleeting power of a uniform, the fragile power of a corporate title, and the ugly power of prejudice. But then there is the enduring power of character, the quiet power of integrity, and the profound power of grace. They took his seat, but they couldn't take his power, because real power doesn't shout. It acts. This leaves us with one final, haunting question. What happens when the person being humiliated doesn't own the airline? Who speaks for them? If you believe every person's dignity matters, whether they are a CEO or not, then help us tell their stories. Like this video to stand for respect. Share it to start a conversation. And subscribe to join our movement, ensuring that no voice is ever silenced again.